I think the hardest thing is like basically knowing yourself. You have to sort of like get to that place first before you can make decisions that are correct. Being creative is about problem solving. Understanding one's own perspective is about finding a way to sort of like put those puzzle pieces together. You're looking at something from this direction, you're looking at something from that direction. Like, what's the crossover?
Yeah.
And how do you sort of like draw something out
Yeah.
from those two? I really stand behind that idea that it's just about decision making, especially in the past 100 years. Being an artist is like, it's like about making decisions.
Yeah.
That's all it is. You can do infinite things. You have to decide what you're going to do. When someone says taste is a skill, that is annoying because you're talking about something that is personal. It's something that you develop over a long period of time. And I just think taste is synonymous with understanding of one's own self. When you talk about it like a skill, then you put it in this sort of like arena of like competition. Consider the possibility that working with your friends on something that you think is cool is like the most luxurious possible thing that you can do. The reward is the work that you get to hang out with your friends and make something cool. I have like very distinct memories of being in class, looking at a textbook, like having to be in a certain chapter and just like flipping ahead to a different chapter that I knew would not be covered just because it's like, what's over here? And I think it's part rebellion, but part just like being interested.
Welcome to Dialectic, episode 40 with Charles Broskoski. Charles is the founder of Are.na, which he spent the last near 15 years building alongside a number of collaborators and co-founders. Are.na is a platform for many things, and it's described in many ways, but I think the best and most useful would be a tool for self-directed education. Are.na is a place where you can find, discover, connect, explore, and archive your ideas, mix match them with everyone else's, and it leads to a kind of curiosity and intentionality around attention and the patterns that we find across the things that are meaningful to us. I talked to Charles extensively about his philosophy behind this kind of education, what goes into what he calls nodal points, or the things that change us, the things we discover, whether it be art, information, whatever, that inflect us over the course of our lives, and why it's so important to give a deep, open, careful attention to those things. We also talk about his and the team's philosophy for building tools and building Are.na, and what it's like to build a platform when it feels more like gardening than architecture. Charles's most important idea when it comes to nodal points is that the radar, the through lines, the connections between us and the things we care about are in fact who we are, that our identity is made up of that radar. And so it's actually far less important what these things are so much as it is what we see in them, what we connect to in them. I think this is an amazing way to think about both authenticity, which is a complicated term and idea, as well as taste, which is another complicated term in the zeitgeist. And yet I think Charles's earnest approach to attention and the deep care that goes into it is clearly represented in Are.na and in how he approaches his writing and discovery and creativity. Finally, we also talk about building independent businesses online, and specifically Charles's approach to building what he calls personal businesses, heavily inspired by the classic film You've Got Mail. Charles believes that whatever you build should, in fact, be deeply personal. Whether you're an Are.na lover or not, I hope this conversation inspires you to have a more open, intentional, careful attention, to look to be surprised, to look to find connections across the ideas and the nodal points for you, and ultimately to make things based on those inspirations. Before we get into the episode, I'd like to thank Notion. Notion is a creative tool for your life's work that teams, big and small, use to collaborate, get leverage from AI and agents, and ultimately turn their ideas into action. Notion natively integrates AI and agents into the place where you actually do your work, all of your context, your documents, your databases, whatever it might be, and lets you get leverage on top of them thanks to AI. What I like about Notion's approach to AI is that they're not trying to automate the important work, the work that deserves your deep attention. In fact, their hope is that by giving you more leverage, you can focus on them even more deeply. I use Notion to prepare for, synthesize, look for patterns across all of my interviews and conversations with Dialectic, both as I'm scavenging for scraps and bits and clues, or as Charles might call them, nodal points ahead of the conversations, and afterwards as I try to pull out the most important ideas and lessons. If you don't use Notion or haven't tried it in a while, you can check it out at notion.com/dialectic. And I hope you are inspired to gather your ideas there, look for interesting tidbits and patterns, and ultimately to make things. If you do, I hope you share them with me. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or give it 5 stars on Spotify, rate it, review it wherever you're listening or watching. And with that, here is my conversation with Charles Broskoski. Charles Broskoski, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Did I get that right? Broskoski?
Broskoski,
Okay.
yeah.
AKA Cab. It seems like you're Cab to almost everyone.
Yeah, Cab is like a nickname I've had my whole life, but it doesn't make sense to say Cab Broskoski because it's my initials. Yeah.
Nice.
It's like a PHP.
Yeah. Well, we ATM machine, we do it all the time.
Yeah.
I want to start with a couple of quotes that are technically about writing, but I think they apply to much of what you are interested in. The first is from Are.na. I think curated by you, but at the very least, it's in the Channel Philosophy channel. And it's Lara Palmquist via Nico Chilla. She says, one of the writer's essential duties is to gather, to filter and weave fragments, to refract perspectives and form new points of contact. The reader, in turn, acts the widsith listening audience, learning from the sojourner's song about how to speak of the textures of life. Such is the ongoing collaborative nature of a language we are not born knowing. We cannot express ourselves without first encountering the words of others. As is often remarked, effective writing serves not as explanation, but invitation, a bowerbird's nest of noticings, calling other minds to take roost.
Oof, that's dense.
The second one's a little more straightforward, but there's a writer I love, Benjamin Labatut. He wrote a book called When We Cease to Understand the World, among other things. And there's an interview of him talking about his creativity. He says, I don't worry much about the shapes of the stories. It is all about research. I try to find things. To me, finding some other person's phrase is more important than coming up with it myself. It is the part that I enjoy. In that sense, writing has become more akin to walking and picking stuff up off the ground. And one final quote from you in some interview with Sophia Epstein. It's nice to look around. I think it's like the full page quote. So my first question is, what is it with obviously that context around collecting? What does it mean to be creative?
Oh my God. Man, you're really starting with the...
Straight into the deep end.
Yes. What does it mean to be creative? Well, I mean, the thing that you're pointing to, I think with those quotes and the thing about being creative are maybe they're related, but they're slightly different. I think those things to me are about like understanding one's own perspective, like you sort of like have to understand like where one's own gaze is naturally drawn to, and that understanding that is sort of like understanding one's own perspective. And being creative, I think, is like making an idiosyncratic combination of those perspectives that you're drawing, And I think a lot about, creativity is such a like weird word now, and it's such a loaded word, and I think it means a lot of different things to different people. To me, it's sort of about problem solving. And I think, it's like the connection that I can draw between those two statements or those two concepts is like being creative is about problem solving. Understanding one's own perspective is about finding a way to sort of like put those puzzle pieces together. You have like, you're looking at something from this direction, you're looking at something from that direction, like what's the crossover and like, how do you sort of like draw something out from those two?
Almost what's the space in between those?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about creativity. We're going to talk a lot about, I think, several things you just implied there. Creativity is an interesting word, as you alluded to, like it means everything and nothing. And I think I want to talk both about the curiosity, learning, research side of you and your world in Are.na, and also the thing you alluded to, which is almost what you refer to as nodal points, like this, what we actually give our attention to.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to linger on creativity just for a second. Two other definitions that I thought were interesting that kind of came up in my research, and I'm curious with the backdrop of your answer. The first is from an Are.na Influences channel, I think via Christina Badal. Creativity is just connecting things.
Mm-hmm.
When you ask creative people how they did something, they feel a little guilty because they didn't really do it. They just saw something. It seemed obvious to them after a while.
Mm-hmm.
And then in another interview, it's actually you, I think you interviewing Yatu. You say both him and Norm, both of you seem like you really understand that creativity has more to do with decision making. I think it takes a lot of artists a long time to understand that.
Yeah. The connecting things is a Steve Jobs quote, which is funny. It's we lean on that a lot, and it feels like the thing that he's describing about being like feeling guilty about pointing to something.
That specifically I'm surprised I didn't recognize it.
Yeah. It's it's longer. But I always feel guilty pointing to him because it's such a it's like such a thing. And the Yatu thing about decision making. Both of those things are the same, are like pointing at the same place, I think. The decision making thing, this is like part of my my like quest to like get more people who would consider themselves creatives to start businesses, because I think like I really stand behind that idea that it's just about decision making, especially now, especially like in the past 100 years, being an artist is like Duchamp. It's like about making decisions. That's all it is, you know. And you have you can do infinite things. You have to decide what you're going to do, and like what is the rubric for deciding what to do. So I mean, the way that Yatu and Norm approach their practice and like how it sort of like blurs this line between art and business, I think is like a perfect example of like, they're just making decisions, you know, they're like focusing on a topic that they really want to, that they like feel the need or like desire to explore. And then, like using their own perspective to sort of like chip away at that topic, you know, and decision making there is just like it's like a personal thing, you know, do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's an aspect of it too that is the decision making is this like engine that is keeping, maybe there's something else that is the wheel in the metaphor, I guess. But there is something about, again, another word that is sort of challenging now, but agency is like inside of that a little bit. And like the most creative people, certainly the most prolific people, to your point, are the ones who are like just like the engine is going.
Yes. Yeah. I think the hardest thing about that is like basically knowing yourself, you know, like you have to sort of like get to that place first before you can make decisions that are correct, at least in my opinion.
Yeah.
You know?
I want to come back to that.
Yeah.
Before we do, I think it's worth talking about what stands out to me across all of these sort of refractions of what Are.na is and is for. You guys say the point of how we describe Are.na is not to box it in, which is great. But it does seem to kind of continually come back to this theme of self-directed education, or learning or curiosity or something. You describe it as Montessori, the reading room at the public library. I went to the New York Reading Room yesterday.
Oh, nice.
You inspired me. It was really lovely as I was finishing up the prep for this. A couple others that you guys, Carly describes it as research as leisure activity. Yeah. Damon's a toolkit for assembling new worlds from the scraps of the old, which is awesome. But again, it's coming back to this learning thing, and specifically a self-directed form of that.
Yes.
Have you always had a desire to be a lifelong learner?
I don't know if I would have like put it in those terms, maybe prior to Are.na, but I was always the type of like reading a different book in class, that kind of thing, you know, or like, going to the library, checking out my own books. And like, that kind of thing has just always been like an impulse.
was some part of it almost rebellion, at least in that example you gave?
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I also remember I have like very distinct memories of being in class, looking at a textbook, like having to be in a certain chapter and just like flipping ahead to a different chapter that I knew would not be covered just because it's like what's over here, you know?
Mm,
And I think yeah, it's part rebellion, but part just like being interested.
yeah.
Yeah.
What, to the extent that's been a common theme, do you have a sense of what causes it, what like really feeds that energy in you and what causes it to atrophy to the extent it goes in waves?
Yeah. Yeah, it really does go in waves. I think that thing. Um, what feeds it? I think it's a little bit of just making space for it. Um, honestly, I find it harder and harder as time goes on because like having a job that's related to using a screen means that like anything that you might be interested in has to compete with every single other thing in the world.
Yes.
So that's tricky. Yeah, it's a little bit like you have to set up the conditions. Well, I don't know about you, but I have to set up the conditions for myself, which means like it's like a little bit ritualistic, you know, like you have to get up in the morning, you have to
Yeah.
like not look at your phone right away. Like it's all these kind of like standard
Yes.
things.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
if
By the
like,
way, I'm not even sure it's real. Like, obviously, it's especially relevant or needed with the internet.
yeah,
But you go like every writer, it's like Seinfeld's got his like room in his house where he locks himself away and he's got his legal
yeah,
pad.
yeah. Well, there's that kind of thing, but then there's also the like connecting to the interest thing. And it's also funny specifically to be working on Are.na because um, I like developed this habit a long time ago of just following any person on Are.na who's like remotely active.
Hmm.
And so like my feed is just like nonstop.
Yeah.
And it's the quality, I have to say, like even if I wasn't being completely biased, is still really, really good. So
Hmm.
that's an interesting part of it where it's like my job to kind of like look at Are.na and make sure it's like functioning properly, but also there's like things pulling, like interesting things pulling at my attention when I go on there.
Hmm.
And I also feel like I have to carve out time to like just use Are.na myself in like a nice way, like I would if I wasn't working on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It says something that you imagine any other content platform on the internet, if you got the entire stream, would
Yeah,
just
no. Yeah,
kill
no.
you.
Yeah. And it's shockingly not overwhelming
Hmm.
on Are.na, but I do wonder what it would be like if I could like roll it back a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your relationship to the word research or to the act of research?
Yeah, I was thinking about this morning because I was listening or I was reflecting on a show that I watched, which is called Neighbors, which just came out on HBO, which is like
Oh,
a
I heard about
reality.
this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Premiere
And
was recent too, so it must have just come out.
very, very
Yeah.
recent, yeah. And one of the neighbors is sort of like a 4chan QAnon type person, and like the word research gets used in that context a lot.
Uh,
You know, where like if you just do the research, like you know what I mean, you'll find you like there's this kind of like yarn on like a cork board kind of like
Yeah.
research thing. And when we started, we had to qualify the word research in a completely different way, which is like it's not academic, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And now we have to qualify it like
It's also not.
it's like it's
not
pleasurable,
QAnon.
you know what I mean? Like it's casual.
Mm.
Um
Yeah,
like
it's a loaded word in a lot of ways. To
it's
your
a
point.
loaded word.
Mm.
Yeah. And I think also the way that people do research now, like it sort of started with these note-taking apps like Rome when that was a thing, and now with ChatGPT and all of these things, doing research like to a person could mean something different, especially when you're thinking about it on the internet. And I try and say like I'd use the Wikipedia rabbit, like following links on a Wikipedia trail as like a way to lean into the self-directedness of what we mean by research, you know.
Do you feel like you are researching when you're using Are.na in your daily life? Like, is that
I don't know what else to call it, you know? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think like research is the closest thing, but it's a little bit more like self-directed exploration.
Yeah. Do you spend much time distinguishing between passive learning and active learning?
No. I don't think so. Yeah, because I think it ends up being the same. It ends up sort of being the same. Does it? No, it feels the same to me, to be honest. Yeah.
That was kind of my sense, and I don't think that would be a conventional view.
Really? Wait, describe the...
Passive learning and active learning. I mean, part of the implication, or maybe at least part of the connotation, might be that passive learning is more likely to be things that like you're doing for fun anyway, or even maybe like quote unquote research. And active learning is like, I have to learn this thing. I mean, I'm probably like even still like too rooted in the traditional like school metaphor.
Yeah, I see what you mean. No, I mean, to me, those things sound like different modes that one might be in, but they don't really sound like the end is all that different, or the motivation to do the thing is all that different.
Okay, maybe that might be something we come back to. One other little thread, I think it was also in that Yatu interview, he apparently had dance in high school, and you had made the comparison between skateboarding and dance, both being these things that you kind of have to teach yourself.
Yes.
Most education, at least youth education, is not that. It's not self-directed or even teaching yourself. What are you pointing at either inside of skate or dance or in general, like these types of activities? What about them builds that self-directed muscle?
For skateboarding in particular, I mean, it's like embarrassing to admit, but I'm 43. I still go skateboard. And the thing that I like about it compared to other forms of physical activity is you really are just deciding at any given point what you're going to do. And it's really based on mood, you know? And the mood of what you're doing is influenced by so many different things. And I mean, without like this is dangerous territory because I could talk about skateboarding for 2 hours, but one's own mood and sort of, I also really hate to use the word taste in this context, but one's own taste in skateboarding and like what you're doing is informed by like consuming hours and hours of skate media, you know, like you almost consume more reference for skateboarding than you do the activity. At least that's how it was when I grew up. So you're sort of like skateboarding and dance are both very referential physical activities because you're sort of like pointing, like every trick has a connotation, you know, and when you're doing something, it's like there's like a certain type of skateboarding that you're doing, you know, and I mean, like I'm being reductive a little bit.
Do you think that like playing guitar has this set of attributes?
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Because what I'm kind of hearing, and maybe I'm forcing it, is there's a classic like idea that you're trying to sound like so and so.
Yeah.
And then you end up sounding like yourself.
Yes.
There's a modeling or something.
Yeah. You kind of like fake it until you make it a little bit. Yeah.
I think that relates a little bit to being a beginner, which I think is something that kind of comes up a lot too. There's an interview with Daisy and Francis at Tasteland. You just brought it up. You say, I'm kind of a poser apologist.
Yes.
If you notice that you're into something, you have to start somewhere. You have to act like you know more than you do. There is some part of presenting yourself as how you want to be that is not bad, just pushing yourself a little bit outwards.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing up my poser philosophy. I love talking about this.
Can posers, are posers earnest, or can they be earnest?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't know if like poser means anything nowadays. I like reflect upon being young and learning how to skateboard and being at the skate park and this like the meme of like your good memories versus your cringe memories, and like the cringe memories are like etched in like
Yeah, I
marble.
saw this.
Like having these like terrible, embarrassing moments of like asking a older skater like how to do something, and you know, like this kind of stuff. I don't think that would happen nowadays. I don't know what I'm getting at. It's sort
Why
of
wouldn't
like
that happen nowadays?
because I think like people have like this, it's the same thing why like I don't think poser is a thing, you know. I think there used to be some sentiment that like one has to pay their dues in any particular activity, and I think that people are much more patient and empathetic towards learning and being a beginner, and like everyone sort of having their place.
I was gonna say more like trying hard is way cooler now.
Trying hard is way cooler now. That's
Even
true.
if even selling out or whatever. Like
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. I think that's true. Yeah. And when I was younger, or like the people that I looked up to were like Gen X people, which like trying it hard is very much not cool. Or it's like way more complicated.
Yes,
like everything has to be done casually.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I do wonder about to the extent you're right in that it is way easier to be a beginner or be open about being a beginner. There is a maybe the realm where we're more performative or where there's more complexity around it is the internet. Like, it still has this bit where like it's cool to again try hard or sell out or whatever. Like everybody's in there. You do a sponsored post and you're in your buddy's comments being like, "Yeah, so sick" or whatever. But like it does feel that I don't know. I think about a place I spent a lot of time, Twitter. Like the dominant artifice of Twitter over the last 5 to 7 years is the dunk.
Yes.
Which is kind of like not. It's kind of like screw you poser.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
And I do think that at least the platform you've built, like there's something inside of this where you're trying to say it's okay. Like
Yeah. I mean, they're very different modes though. Like, even though you would, like, Are.na is considered social only because there's some, like, activity can be public, you know? But I don't think it's social in the sense of Twitter, where, like, the point is to talk to other people, you know? Like the things that you're interacting with on Are.na's content, and you might interact with a person through content,
right?
But on Twitter, you're just interacting with people, basically.
There's a few thoughts coming to mind. One is you have somewhere where you describe social networks that are about doing an activity as being more. You didn't say virtuous, but I think that's kind of the implication. And you may have even been thinking about GitHub, at least old GitHub. And so there's something inside of that. I guess I'm interested both in that and this notion that like it doesn't have to be like Are.na could be a totally private tool.
Yes.
I've used a lot of these types of tools that are much more private. And it seems, maybe I'm wrong, maybe there's a whole back catalog of things that aren't visible to me, but in doing a lot of you have a lot of Are.na channels. And a lot of like why do that all in public? Is it a default thing? Is it something else?
Yeah, it has to do with the sort of like different modes for me.
Okay.
And I think this different people have different approaches to this. For me, for some of my beloved channels, doing them in public has like a little bit of extra pressure that sort of makes me more careful with them. Whereas if it was, the public on Are.na is so slight that it really almost means nothing. Like no one is paying attention to what I'm doing, really. But
I'm not sure that's true, but a couple of asterisks. One, you could say it's sort of like if you were publishing on a website, but not under your real name. Like it's out there, but it's not. Like that's kind of what you're implying. But also, you're the CEO of this platform. Like in theory, if anyone's going to be looking at anything on Are.na, like people are going to be looking at your stuff. No.
Maybe, but I think it really sort of like comes across as just like, oh, you know what I mean? Like, I think I don't think it's like people aren't analyzing takes in the way that they do on Twitter. You know, the interpersonal dynamics that come up on Twitter don't happen in the same way.
Of course. Do you have many private channels?
Yes, I probably have like equal private channels.
So this is what I'm interested in, which is like to go back to the original theme, which is like, I think the point of this, not the only point of Are.na, but certainly the way you seem to be using it, and one of the stated uses is this self-directed education and research.
Yeah.
If that is the goal, perhaps it is this thing you've picked up, which is like, it's almost an external pressure. Like if I know I'm writing something for an audience of 1 or 5 versus a journal, it does change the work. And so maybe it's kind of like that.
Yeah. That's part of it. But also, I mean, the thing that happens on Are.na, the reason, the real rationale to make something public is that things that you're adding to your channels will, if it's public, then other people will add those things to their channels. So you sort of like ambiently get exposed to other things that may or may not have to do with what you're
you get
looking
serendipity
at
kind of as a pipe in.
Exactly. And that's the utility of, that's the reason why having it be social at all, you know?
Yes.
And I mean, I think to relate it back to this, like, comparison to GitHub, at least when I first started publishing code to GitHub, like doing things open source, I don't know, like those things feel scary when before you do them. And then you realize that the feeling of those kinds of platforms where it's like public, but having it be public is not the point of it. It has like a different quality to it, which is like the publicness is a utility to you and to other people.
Yeah.
And it's a dynamic that's like, it's really nice actually, once you sort of like get a handle on it.
Yeah. It had me wondering about like whether this might be more, we've sort of all assumed that like social networks, first of all, we hardly even have social networks. We have whatever, like the Instagram and Twitter aren't social networks. They're content platforms.
Yeah, sure.
But it's definitely closer, somewhere in between Twitter and Are.na. But like I was thinking of there's a platform I like called Letterbox for movies.
Yeah.
And there is something about the fact that it's kind of, or Strava maybe.
Exactly.
It is kind of like this single player thing that can then.
Yes.
And I think there's something there.
Yeah. And I think that's why people point to, Letterbox, Strava, any kind of platform where there's a primary
thing to do
and there's a secondary social part of it. Like it always ends up being better. And it's also easier to make a business around those things than there are
it's
just
telling that all of those are subscription businesses.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, also it's why people still, like, I still see people point to Pinterest as being like one of the last places on the internet, you know, even though it's like a shopping platform, it still feels like that, I think, to a lot of people.
I wonder if that's ripe for more new things. One other core part of this that maybe blurs between what I think we will talk about around the attention and nodal point stuff, but we were talking before we started recording, a clear, an essential part of the medium of Are.na is the channel, and thus, like, I think one articulation of that would be the pattern. There's a quote from Chris Alexander. He says, "At the core of these books is the idea that people should design for themselves their own houses, streets, and communities. This idea comes simply from the observation that most of the wonderful places of the world were not made by architects, but by the people." That's him talking about, I think it's all 3 books, so Timeless Way and Pattern Language. And so I thought it was an interesting way to start this conversation, which is particularly under the theme of like self-directed learning. There's something about organizing ideas in this way. If you want to take it in a kind of high concept form, you could call it a pattern. If you want to go low concept, you call it a meme or whatever. What is it about these kind of contextual buckets that like are helpful in learning and maybe eventually in making, to go back to Alexander's point?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, I can only speak to my own experience and my own way of using Are.na, which is that like the channels that I really have at the forefront, I sort of just use them as like a way to filter things that I'm seeing. It's like a perspective through which to view a certain piece of information. Like, does it belong here or does it not belong here?
Yes.
And then when it belongs, when you might sort of like open up the bounds a little bit and say like, oh yes, this does belong here, like come on in. And now all of a sudden the bounds are shaped a little differently. And then you just have a way of looking at a piece of information or an idea or whatever that feels more personal,
Well, there's a memory part. There's a lot of things happening inside of that thing you describe, which is like partially it's a little bit just like, I know where this goes.
Yeah.
And thus maybe it'll be easier for me to filter it and remember it or whatever. To your point, there's also, you can imagine a channel that you've just created that has 3 things in it. If you add a 4th thing, it changes
it changes everything. Yeah.
Versus if it has that. Are you typically creating channels or patterns or whatever these things are? Like you read one or come across one thing, like how do they form?
Yeah, it's usually like I've been noticing something, or like I've been noticing an idea forming, and it has to do with a couple of things. And so typically the way it starts for me at least is it will start in private. It will be a couple of things to start. You know what I mean? And it needs to be like between 3 and 5 or something.
Yeah.
And then once you have that, then you have like enough of a frame to like judge other things against.
Right.
Yeah. And like now, like, yeah, I have like maybe 10 of these types of channels that like over the years. And now I think the bar for me is so high of like what that frame could look like. Like it has to be so, it's not complex, but it's more like nuanced and some combination of being nuanced and new, that I haven't made a new one, or I haven't had like a new successful one in a while.
I suspect, my sense is what you just described is actually a phenomenon that happens across as creative people become more experienced. The benefit is they have more of these like, whether or not they use any of this language or not, even this conception or not, it's easier for them to slot things in.
Yeah.
But the weakness might be something along the lines of what you just described, which is that they're more rigid in what their set of patterns are.
Yeah. 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 The bar raises, I think. And it doesn't necessarily raise in terms of like grandiosity, but it's something more subtle than that. I mean, I will say, I think that the last couple of ones that I've had that have been successful just end up turning into essays. Like the things, the collection of things sort of happen first, or I notice that I'm saying the same ideas to people, like a couple of the same ideas over and over.
Yep.
And that means I'm thinking about something, and then there are other things in the world that remind me of that thing that I'm thinking of. And it's the life cycle, at least in recent times for me, has been that the frame has come up, and then it sort of shortly turns into an essay, and then
Well, this would be one of the strongest cases for this type of thinking. Maybe it goes back to the Christopher Alexander quote. I suspect that makes it way easier to actually make the essay. Write the essay.
Definitely.
Is like I have an organizing frame. It's kind of like otherwise you're just gathering scraps, and it's like you haven't done the work to connect all the dots.
Yeah, definitely for me. Yeah. And I mean, obviously writing and collecting references are 2 very different things. I find collecting references to be infinitely pleasurable and writing to be excruciating.
Well, maybe that's a form of passive and active learning.
Yeah,
in some
maybe.
sense.
Yeah, maybe.
Right.
Yeah. Having the sort of like bar of you can't just have these things be like sort of peasantly opaque and like pointing to something mysterious.
It's like glob.
Right.
Yeah. There's a line I love, which is writing is high resolution thought.
Yeah.
Or another one actually comes from Paul Graham, the Y Combinator guy, he says writing turns your ideas from vague to bad.
Yeah. Exactly.
But there is some kind of like, and obviously writing isn't the only form, but there's something very fun and generative about one, and very kind of like, it's almost compression.
Yeah.
It's like taking all those.
Yeah. It's the decision making thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, one other quote that maybe relates to that. You had said the things that do well in Are.na tend to be prismatic. They do well with a lot of different perspectives, and you can put your own perspective into it.
Yes.
Maybe this relates more into the social side. I'm curious, have you ever had an experience where you've really seriously adopted somebody else's pattern or channel into how you kind of think or create, or you're adding a lot to, or whatever?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there are patterns that come up on Are.na, not necessarily in terms of like how it, like what kind of conceptual frame to draw around a set of references, but just patterns of using it in sort of like an open-ended way. Like someone started this like inbox pattern of just like making an open channel, calling it an inbox, and saying like, or like, this is a guest book, like come sign my guest book.
Almost like a
basically.
user, like a UI kind of thing.
Yeah. Someone else started this thing of like prepending your channel titles with a symbol so that they're grouped together in your index. Stuff like that. Like I definitely adopt from other people. Yeah.
Are there ways that you found that seeing the world in these types of buckets can be limiting?
That's a good question. I'm like embarrassed to say no. I do not think that they can be limiting. I think for me, it feels very productive to have a sort of like set of constraints. And I find the constraints that Are.na has to be extremely productive. Like I think that myself and other people who I work with Are.na on all sort of like use it the same way and are really like, I don't know how to put it. Like it's really hard at this point to imagine a different mode of working that is not like Are.na, not like using Are.na. Yeah.
You've grown, you've evolved around this certain type of scaffolding.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I'm like deep in, Yeah.
Yeah, for better or for worse.
Yeah, for better
so there
or for
probably
worse.
are some limitations, but also it's been really empowered. Like you've been augmented by this this kind of way of doing things. One last little bit on this, which is, I guess the implication if you're gathering all these things is that you might eventually look through them. Different ways people have described. I think Damon Zucconi said it's effectively just building a personal archive, or maybe this was you archiving the casual web. Two other quotes I really liked. One from the Describe Are.na at a Party channel. Everything not saved will be lost, which comes from the Nintendo quit screen message, which is so good. And then this other Wikipedia term I found, I can't remember what channel it was on, but it's sundoku. Which is acquiring reading materials but letting them pile up in one's home without reading them, Japanese. I think that last bit actually really has the implication I wanted to pull at, which is how often do you really dumpster dive the archives? And maybe this goes back to the writing versus just, it's really fun to just like pick up shiny objects all the time. Going back through the archive certainly doesn't necessarily mean to be turning it into an essay, but it is a little bit of a different mode. And so I'm curious how you relate to that.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I have these channels that I sort of like treat in a more special way than my other ones. And I go back through those all the
almost
time.
Like they're a gallery or something. Maybe that's not quite the right connotation. But
something like that. Yeah.
They're slightly more solidified or crystallized.
Yeah. Or there's just something about the frame that I find like continually attractive. And at this point, having gone back and looked at them so much, it feels like all of that stuff is mine.
And you know it well. You've traced those grooves almost.
Yeah. But also like the things there are like I'm responsible for, not like it's not like someone else. It's like all me.
They've been in my house long enough that they're mine.
Yeah, exactly. But then some of the other things like are new, this is not like not like a commercial for a new app, but like the new app has like a widget on it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so like hooking up some of my like very gigantic channels to that, channels that might be more like I'm like throwing a link in here to read later. Sometimes I'll get to them and sometimes I don't, but like having them just continually come up is also just a nice way of like, I think part of our job as like people who are maintaining and building Are.na is figuring out thoughtful ways of resurfacing that stuff without being too didactic about
Yes.
it. Yeah.
Yes. Well, and there's as someone who used a lot of tools from Delicious, all like there is a temptation. I'm curious and I like dopamine from new information. So I'm doing the Sudoku thing, but there are diminishing returns.
No, diminishing. Yeah. No, I have a real problem buying books. Like I have way too many books. Yeah.
Let's talk about nodal points.
Yes.
There's so many kind of different ways to take this, but maybe a place to start. Two quotes. One that's maybe just energetically sets the tone. It's a tweet from Ted Nelson.
Oh, great.
All caps.
Yeah.
There is too much to say, and it goes in all directions. This is not just a slogan, but my most fundamental belief.
Yes.
And then a quote from you in this excellent piece you wrote that I think if any people are going to go read anything, maybe this or one other that we'll come to later, but you have a piece called Here for the Wrong Reasons, in which you describe nodal points. And you go on to say, when you encounter a piece of life-changing information, no matter how large the change part is, you are simultaneously discovering and creating yourself, becoming incrementally more complete. Your perspective is made up of a meandering line through these points. Learning, or maybe some precursor to learning, is a lot about developing the intuition to recognize when something you find in the world is going to be a nodal point for you. There's a lot there. Maybe the first place to start would be what is life-changing information? Or what are you getting at when you say that?
I don't know. I feel like it's different for everyone. Like, do you feel like you can point to like an early piece of life-changing information?
There's a really important part of the piece, perhaps, that anchors this, I think, or at least sets the tone around it, which is you're describing kind of these Borges and Hell.com and skateboarding. Like you're describing. And so I think that with that tone, certainly, I think maybe somewhere else you describe it as something that causes an inflection.
Yeah.
And so at the very least with regard to art, I think it's easy to think about what were the things that kind of helped me develop that intuition you're describing.
Yeah. Like I also said in the piece, I tend to like, my weakness is nostalgia, and this is like a family weakness. Like my whole family is afflicted with this, but I think about early books, and wonder whether or not like the book formed the inclination or like the inclination was there and I recognized it in the book.
Yep.
And that's kind of like the thing that I think I'm trying to point out with this thing, which other people do as well. And so the life-changing part is like I think it's about that recognition. You know what I mean? Like it's about just sort of understanding like this thing is made for me, or I'm made for this thing, or me and this thing share a strong connection. And like I said before, I think the hardest thing about like being creative is just understanding yourself, So the change part is sort of about this, like understanding yourself, understanding your own perspective, Yeah. And whether or not the perspective is made when you encounter the thing, or if it was already there, it's a quantum question.
Yeah. They're sort of artifacts where you had that experience of feeling, like of realizing that there really are things out there that feel like they were made for you.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe a part of this then on this never-ending kind of path towards completeness or cohesiveness, you describe somewhere else in that piece like it's sort of like these things are contributing as a piece of a very large puzzle, at least considered in retrospect. Maybe I answered the question in how I asked that, but like, do you aspire to completeness or towards some kind of fullness?
No.
Okay.
I think that this is like never ending, ideally.
Yeah.
You know, because I think,
Is it increasing? Like, is the picture dialing in resolution?
yeah, it's dialing in resolution. That's a good metaphor. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. But I don't think there's like a,
Perfect.
yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, there's a Kevin Kelly line I like where he says the goal of life is to become yourself by the time you're on your deathbed.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is maybe
exactly. Yeah.
but it's asymptotically approaching a limit.
Yeah.
Another kind of key frame or key idea you use in the piece is this idea of radar. And you're pulling from desire lines, but effectively, I think the critical point here is that it's a verb, not a noun, in terms of how we relate to these things that are these objects of our attention, more active than static reference. One other piece, you're describing desire lines, which are these, the classic image of the walkway, and then there's an additional path made through the grass that shows where people actually wanted to go. And you describe desire lines as a path made by walking.
Yeah.
So there's an active orientation here.
Yeah.
Why is that active part? Maybe to tie it back to anything that we enjoy. Like, why is that active recognition, the agency inside of it? Like, why is that so critical?
I think it's so critical because it feels increasingly rare, you know? Like, it's really hard to feel a connection to one's own radar, you know? And I think there's so many things that diminish one's own ability to have a connection to your own radar. So, yeah.
And just maybe to define it, since I'm pulling from these ideas, a
Sure.
radar is the reason you care about a quote unquote nodal point.
Sure. Yeah.
A nodal point being one of these things that change is inflection.
Right. The recognition of the thing, like the thing belongs to me, or like me and the thing have this
Some kind of relationship.
Some kind of relationship. Like that recognition is what I'm calling radar. It's attention, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
But again, an active attention.
It's an active attention.
Because I consume many, many things for which there's no radar happening.
Yes, 100%.
To go back to your point. Right.
Yeah. I think the radar's ability becomes dulled over time. You know, with a lot of exposure to information. That's one part of it. But the other part of it is, I mean, it's like literally gigantic corporations' business models to try and hijack the radar without being too like social networky about it. Like that's what it, you know what I mean? That's what it is.
Yeah. Yes. And there's like it's a diffuse attention maybe versus a highly active attention.
Yeah. I mean, like the way that I was describing earlier, this like, this sort of like ritualistic thing of like getting into the mode of wanting to sort of like explore ideas or let your intuition guide you or something like that. Like the stage has to be pretty clear, in my opinion, or at least for me.
Yeah.
And so like it really means that like one should like not have a lot of things like pulling at you.
That's kind of what I meant by diffuse. It's like
exactly. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, which is, I mean, it's a hard, like you have to actively, I mean, one part of it is having active attention or active radar, but you have to actively try to set the conditions for yourself. Yeah,
it's this kind of like the magnitude or something of our attention. I mean, I guess it's not like, I'm trying to think about the ways to distinguish this. I could be incredibly engaged with something that I don't have this relationship to. Part of that's just a medium. Like if I go see a film versus I'm scrolling my phone. Like I guess maybe part of my question is like, how much of this is about reflecting on it or something like I suspect there were things that you just happened to come across that you actually had very little intentionality towards.
100%.
And they like blew you.
Yes. Yeah. But you have to, I think I think the thing that I'm sort of trying to point at is like you have to be in the mode where it's possible to recognize it or it's possible to be blown away by the
Mm.
thing. And there's different types of being blown away,
Yeah.
you know, like one can be blown away just by like the pure artistry of a film or
Yeah.
something like that. And you might not have this sort of like personal connection that I'm trying to illustrate or articulate. But the personal connection thing, I think, is like you really have to, you know what I mean? Like there's a certain mode, and
Yes.
it's a fleeting kind of mode also, you know. Like
Perhaps what you're implying at some level is that actually, um, regardless of what the object is, I need to be at a certain state
yeah. Yeah, like you have
for
to be ready
it
for
to.
the
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's another piece of this, which is obviously we've been talking around it, but like you go on to kind of explicitly talk about how this ties into identity.
Yeah.
You say your radar is you, not the things you focus on, but the orientation, the internal rule set, your magnetism towards things, the natural intuition that you've had your whole life. Forgive me if this is a little too esoteric, but like maybe this is a distinction between we are what we love and like we literally are our love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah. No, that's also part of trying to figure this out is
Yeah.
like, yes, it's not the things, like it's not the
this
collection of
collection. Yeah.
things. It's like the fact that you recognize the thing. Yeah.
Where my mind went with thinking about this was almost like you can imagine a sort of youthful, like a teenager
Yeah.
who really has attached their identity to like the music they're into or
Yeah,
whatever.
right.
And it's like they haven't quite made this jump yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're like, who are you? Well, I have all of these
Yeah.
songs.
Yeah. I'm super into hardcore or whatever. Yeah.
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 Hmm. Hmm. Why do you think it's tempting to do that, at least for young people? Like, why do you think it's so tempting to map our identity not to the radar, but to the objects?
That's a really good question. I have no idea. But I think like
Maybe it's because there's a preciousness about the objects.
yeah, when you first see those things that feel very special to you, like you think it must be the thing. It's not me.
Right.
It's not me. It's that like that thing is special. You know, I think it takes a really long time to understand
Yeah.
that like in the way that teenagers might describe like a band or a song or something, you know, this sort of like cliche thing of like you gotta listen, like it's the best thing in the world.
It'll change
you
your
know what I
life.
mean? And it's not, yeah, right. You'll change your life, yeah. But it's not actually like this is like a certain thing for a certain person at a certain time period. Like there's
Right.
there's conditions at play.
It relates, I think, to another thing you go on to kind of think about and discuss in the piece, which is, actually, it's rooted in this notion of like, there might be rocks I haven't turned over almost.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what if there are no little points that are going to change my inflection points that are going to totally change my life that I haven't discovered?
Yeah.
If there were one soulmate out there for me and I haven't found them or whatever, like, and what you kind of go on to, let me see if maybe I have it. Yeah, what gives me anxiety is if there's a nodal point out there that I will never come across, what if the one is a piece of information that I will never get a chance to give my attention to? And then Damon Zucconi kind of reframes it as like, we actually have thing-shaped holes in us.
Yeah.
And where my mind went, and I think this ties back to the teenager thing, who hasn't learned this yet,
Mm-hmm.
and it creates an abundance, maybe, which is like, my love is abundant, and I can find things to give it to, and it's actually not the things.
Yeah. Yes. Damon is really regretful about how he articulated that the thing-shaped holes. I think like I'm very sorry, Damon, that we're bringing this back up. But yeah. It goes back to the thing of like it's a verb, not a noun. Like like the thing that you're pointing towards could be anything, and no one can really tell you what that thing is. You know, like. Yeah, I tend to also think about like the way that I use Are.na or the way that I like go through a used bookstore with this sort of like thrift store mentality. You know what I mean? Like a person could go into a thrift store and maybe buy anything and put in the right context, that thing was the right thing to buy, you know? And same thing on Are.na, like there's no telling, like quality is a sort of like, it's not like a, I don't know I don't know how to try and quite articulate what I'm trying to say, but like quality is sort of not like on a binary scale. It's like there's this all encompass thing, way at which one can approach a thing.
Yes.
In the same way, like again, like not to like over reference Duchamp, but like just like taking a thing out of a situation and putting it into a different context, like that can be done with anything.
Yeah.
The shittiest JPEG that you see, you can like take that and like find something meaningful from it if it's like coming from the right.
Yeah, if you're
place.
open.
Yeah, if you're open to it. Yeah.
There's a Annie Albert's quote, Materials Metaphor. Students worry about choosing their way. I always tell them you can go anywhere from anywhere.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And that's the kind of thing that I mean, like, gives me comfort and anxiety at the same time, you know, because it really foregrounds agency and one's own perspective and highlights this thing of like the most important thing is like knowing yourself, you know.
Yes.
Like it's the only thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
One other piece of this that kind of had me thinking about, you can kind of be curious in like a truly open-ended way without much discretion. You say, I feel like I have to constantly remind myself of the things I'm actually interested in. Sometimes I wonder if there's a problem with being too curious. That is, when you feel like you're interested in everything. While we do want to cultivate a curiosity, we also think about encouraging more sustained, deep thinking. Put another way, like overly simplified, like curiosity and adoration are not the same. Or deep attention are not the same.
Yeah.
And so I wonder about that with like one view just says like, if there really are infinite nodal points and it is about my disposition, I mean, like maybe that's the answer, but like, I should just be like, like looking at as many things as possible and just like waiting to see like, whereas I think what you're implying here and what feels maybe more resonant to me, especially if it is about my disposition and not the thing, is that I should be looking more carefully at fewer things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's something like that, but I don't think there's like a one-sized solution. I don't know if I believe that. I mean, I'm like, as you're talking, I'm sort of thinking about the mode in which a person is going down, like everyone goes down, finds themselves going down a Wikipedia hole.
Right.
You know,
Right.
it's like the purest reason to believe that like hyperlinking was like a good decision, you know. It's like fulfilling that dream.
Yeah.
But I don't think that sometimes one can find like a thing that's important in that kind of activity, but I don't always think that like just going down a Wikipedia hole is like it's much better than just sort of like letting your feed take you, but it doesn't mean like it's a step towards the right direction, but it's not always an indication that like this is going to like yield good results.
Yes.
Or good, like life-changing information.
It's sort of, I think, goes a little bit back to the passive versus active.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like TikTok is full passive.
Yes. Yeah.
Learning. And then like, I don't know, like doing extremely hard research in the stacks is, and like, yeah, maybe the point is to sort of oscillate there and catch yourself if you're just doing maybe this brings up an interesting question. It's like, should this always feel fun or easy?
I don't think it's like, it's something, I wouldn't call it like fun or easy, but it's related to those things. Like it's
downhill, like,
no, I don't think it necessarily needs to feel downhill. I think it needs to feel, like engaging is not the same thing as fun, you know?
Yeah. I'm pulling this thread and I'm kind of locked in.
Yeah. That's a nice place to be. And I think, like I just said, like, I don't think that's like an indication of something. It's not an indication of like, the gold is there, but like having that kind of practice, I think is like useful for getting towards what I'm talking about. Just being able to have a sort of like radar or an attention, like a radar or an attention span that's like, that feels more tuned, for like lack of a better word.
Tuned feels like a good word.
Yeah.
I want to briefly broach the topic of taste, which you already alluded to being messy. As a quote, people often think about making work as if the person on the other side will have no choice but to enjoy it if the work is good enough. But it's nice to think about the practice of viewing or consuming as an art form in itself. I think this is kind of getting at something we already talked about a little bit. But it is interesting because it sort of does feel like sometimes there is work that is good enough, like a work that is so like, I don't know, I'm thinking like on one hand, there is stuff I have engaged with that I guess my act of viewing or consuming was an art form in and of itself, and that it took a lot of work. And there are other things where like I watched Casablanca for the first time recently, and like it didn't take, like there wasn't much effort required.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not really sure what my question is.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard also to like in this particular time period in the past 3 days when we find ourselves in like Taste Wars 10 or whatever.
Like, yeah, this is literally it's a sequel to a sequel to a sequel.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to think that there is a distinction between objectively or like nearly objectively good things, versus things that feel specific to a person. Yeah. I think there's something different there. And I think one is just like being able to recognize and appreciate what a person has done. But and another thing is like recognizing that like this person is talking about something that you feel like you've been thinking about for your whole life but haven't been able to articulate.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think like I hate now to use the word taste, but I think that if I were to try and like really hone in on a definition that I thought was correct, or describe the quality that like people that I know who I think like have the best taste in the world, it's more towards that the second relationship, which is just like
it's a self-knowledge, right?
Yeah,
like
it's a self-knowledge.
It's the thing you keep coming back to.
Yeah.
There's one of the next things I had, and I think it really connects. You had reflected on having Corey Archangel as your professor, I think, in college.
Yeah.
And describing this kind of experience in class. You say the first part of class was everyone talking through some links they found on the internet. People would bring in things that may not seem interesting at first, but Corey was amazing at parsing out why something might be interesting. It showed you it's important to think deeply about why you like what you like. First of all, like I think a really wonderful and kind of generous thing. Like, what do you think made him good at that? To what extent did you learn about even being able to do that for yourself from him?
He like, I mean, I don't want to like overstate it and embarrass him, but like I think he played a large part in that kind of practice or looking at things with that sort of perspective of like kind of like it's a game, that like taking something out of context, like whatever the thing is, a piece of media content or whatever, and like placing it here and having it kind of be like a reflection on you, and that as like a move was like just like a different way of relating to things that I feel like I had experience, but like he took it to like a different level, in my opinion. And he like, I remember him. So I was his first studio assistant after college, and he very generously took me around to like see art shows. Like his studio was in Chelsea, and we would like go on a lunch break and then just be like, okay, like let's just go look at shows. And he would just like show me around and like talk about how he was like looking at things and like why something might be interesting and maybe like what the context around something might be. like he was also very young at the time and like also sort of trying to understand this for himself, but being sort of like open source about how he was coming to an understanding. And I remember him talking about like, oh yeah, like, this like person can just put a, like a mop in a gallery and it's like, you're just like rolling your eyes, but then you think about like where this person's coming from, just this kind of thing of like relating to me in like a human way. This sort of like gestural conceptual art way of relating to things in the world.
It sounds both like properly critical, but also like very personal.
Yes, that's a really nice way to put it.
Which is, I think, something we tend to forget in the conversation about all these things. Like, I just want to, the taste thing again is sort of silly, but like, I always like to bring up like, taste is kind of like, it's like a product of eating food. It's like, what do I actually like? We're talking about it as like, we're going around pointing at all these dishes, but we haven't tried, being like, this is the good one.
Yeah. And that's why, I mean, like we should not get into this, but like the conversation around this is annoying because I mean, when someone says taste is a skill, that is annoying because you're talking about something that is personal. It's something that you develop over a long period of time. And it's, to me, again, like, I just think taste is synonymous with like an understanding of one's own self. And when you talk about it like a skill, then you put it in this sort of like arena of like competition, and like people are comparing one's own taste to another one's, which like doesn't really make any sense. It's like saying I'm like better than you because I like this, like to your point is like I like this hot dog, you don't like this hot dog, like I'm better than you is insane.
When you put it like that, it's both insane and also like totally plausible. Like people, we do that. I want to come back to the competitiveness, but one last thing on this briefly. I think this was in that same Tasteland interview. You said there's no single thing that could convince me that someone has good taste. It's the composite. And I think the implication here is that, or at least one implication is that it takes time to evaluate both somebody else, but also ourselves in taste. And so I guess like as one kind of final piece on this, or maybe to not use that word, like this, why is duration and almost like reference to yourself over the course of time so important in this self-knowledge as you kind of grow through it?
Yeah. Well, so I think, I mean, part of this class that you were talking about with Corey Archangel, like we were using Delicious, and Delicious was just this, what basically the way it worked is you would send links to Delicious instead of saving them to a bookmarks bar. So you would look back and see this sort of like trajectory of like, oh, I was thinking about this thing. Like this thing was important enough for me to save. And then like a week later, like I can sort of draw the connections between these two things. And so I think the duration is like, it's about a sort of like ongoing conversation that you're having with yourself. And yeah, I mean, when you bring up this, like, there's not one single thing that could convince me that a person has good taste. Like I think about someone who I think has like the best taste in the world, who I know, is Chris Sharon, who was our original designer, who's also like the designer for K-Hole and a musician and just like has impeccable taste and highly idiosyncratic. I don't know like if this is still a thing. I mean, I have to like air out his taste for a second, but like I don't know if it's still a thing for him, but he's like was for a long period of time obsessed with Tom Cruise. And I'm like thinking about that versus like every other thing that he likes, like it makes sense, but when you just take that one thing, it like sounds like it's not evidence. You know what I mean? Like the trajectory is the thing.
It's almost like to extend the food metaphor, it's almost like a dish. Like there's this ingredient in the context of all these other ingredients is quite interesting.
Yeah.
When you say he has great taste, one other kind of, you even admitted at the time you didn't love this framing. It was sort of like this person's world is complete, and maybe what you're getting at is like it was more cohesive. The resolution is dialed. Like, is that what you mean? When you say he had great taste, what do you specifically mean?
It's so like it's at once refined, but it's also so specific to him and his personality.
Right.
And when you see the connection in a person with like those two qualities
It's like a
going hand in
self-knowing
hand,
that can be really active.
right? A self-knowing that can be really active, but also like works in the world in a sort of like particular gestalt that like couldn't really be replicated by someone else.
Yeah. I like that a lot. You briefly referenced the kind of competitive nature of taste. The other kind of big idea you're working through in that piece, Here for the Wrong Reasons, is this, what you, I think, frame as like competitive realities.
Yeah.
And there's an articulation you have where you're talking about like thinking, the incentive is for us to all think of ourselves as brands and think of information or content as like a resource to use in this way. You go on to make an amazing Bachelor reference with Here for Fame, not love. And you say, someone whose interests are more strategic than personally intuitive, a person whose interests accumulate with an awareness of how they will reflect back onto them, a person who follows nodal points not from an innate desire, but from the expectation of some kind of reward, social or otherwise. There isn't a clean way to get around the idea that personal expression is always at least in part performative. Expression is partly fun because it's performative. And so like those two together, the first is this total cynicism, you're here for fame, not for love. The second quote, I should have made clear, it was distinguished. Like those are in tension a little bit. Like your platform, like Are.na itself is actually a great example of this, where it's like, it seems to be sort of resisting or you're trying to have it resist the perils of the first part, but also all taste is a little performative, a little bit, like even to ourselves.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm curious how you like square those two things. Like what amount of performativeness is tolerated? Is it about a self-awareness about performativeness?
Yeah, I think it's about motivations and expectations, you know. And when it like I mean like these are like my own rules now that I'm just like coming up with.
Great.
But I think that in my mind, doing it in public and having it be performative and just being confident with like I want to say joy, you know, like finding joy in a thing, showing off a thing with joy, not expecting like someone to look upon, not the whole motivation can't be like I'm showing off and you should look at me as someone with good taste.
Or
which
even
I
I
think
want a specific reaction.
I want to, yeah, you can't basically want any kind of reaction at all in my, in this worldview of like standards.
Is joy performative though? Like
Yeah.
real joy, I would argue, probably isn't very performative. It's enthusiastic. It's not internal.
Yes. It's like this rare combination of being able to, like show the thing with love and do it in public, without expectation, which I think is extremely hard and maybe almost naive at this point to expect.
A child could do it easily, though.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think that's on the kind of broader theme of competition, and I think you alluded to this earlier. Two more quotes. Social media has largely made permanent a world of individual realities, but it also underpinned that world with the perspective that the larger structure holding everything together is competition. In order for your reality to be the most real, it has to win. And then a second quote, you have to think of content or information as a resource. And doing so means that in some ways you're producing or consuming in order to cultivate a position rather than treating content as something out there to be curious about, to be fascinated by, or to love. The last part, obviously, I think is the thing hanging over all this and like this authentic taste, whatever. Like, I guess what I was thinking about a little bit is like this idea that in order for your reality to be the most real, it has to win. Like artists and you, and maybe we'll get to this. I don't know if you still consider yourself an artist, but like a part of that is actually being opinionated. In fact, I know you're quite opinionated about software and how you make software. And so on one hand, like great artists are sometimes just like loving or whatever, the joy thing, but oftentimes they're saying something.
Yeah.
They're actually trying to have their reality win.
Yeah.
And maybe this gets back to the same tension we were just discussing around performance.
Yeah.
But like, maybe it depends on the context. Maybe it depends if you're just in this sort of enthusiastic learning period versus constructing something.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think like a really good example, like it's just top of mind. I'm making an excuse to bring up Taste Wars 10, but like a really good example is seeing the different ways that this is sort of like playing out on Twitter, and people taking one side against this sort of like taste is a skill thing, other people taking other sides. It's like, it feels like people are trying to align themselves properly, and that the goal is not so, I mean, whatever. This conversation is annoying for a lot of different reasons, but like one of the reasons it's annoying is that it feels like the goal in the end is to like end up on the winning side of this.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
And
to feel, honestly, in this case, to feel better about one's own like
position.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is like a problem with Twitter in itself. But like, but like the other part of it is, well, it's a sort of thing of talking about the thing you're doing rather than like doing the thing, you know? And when you talk about taste, then you're like talking about the idea of loving something and not like actually putting your attention towards the thing or whatever. But I think in relationship to that, maybe when I was like going to art shows in New York more regularly, experiencing a show, feeling like it was successful, like something ineffable was communicated to me, and not really feeling like that was so much of a competition, but more of an ongoing conversation. This is sort of like a long way of saying that like the motivation towards these things plays a large part in how the tone of that thing goes, you know? Like if one is like doing these things to like dunk on someone to like end up in the right spot so that they will be in a better spot later on, that's different than like, I've been thinking about this thing for a really long time, like I'm gonna articulate this in the best way.
And by the way, I
possible.
care about the response, but in a way that is less about my ego, perhaps. I mean, it's a delicate thing, but
it's a delicate thing because it always comes into play. But right. I think like you care about, I think in one mode, you care about the response because you want the conversation to keep going, because you love the conversation so much that you want things to be generative, and you want to add to the conversation so that someone else can add to that, you know?
The other is to signal.
The other is to signal. Yeah. And they're like percentages of everything and every way of dealing with this, obviously.
Yeah. Obviously, so much of this is about attention. And I think really what the piece is about loving attention, right? I was also thinking there was some kind of brief line you just said, we have to pick which things we give our attention to. There's a finiteness about human attention, and it's hard not to think about that in the context of like this other form of intelligence where we've created, which the whole feature and bug of it is that it has infinite attention, basically. Yeah. There's this quote you have about it that prompted something for me, which is, if you're really focusing on the moment, on something you love, on something in the world that feels like it's made for you, you can't be thinking about how it will benefit you or how it will reflect back on you. We were just talking about this. These two modes are at odds with each other. True attention requires that you don't view something in the world through the lens of what can this thing do for me? Yeah. And I have a couple questions on this, but my first is, can you fake it till you make it on this front? Meaning, like, can you be a poser around it and then end up loving it?
Yes, I totally believe that. That's why I'm a poser apologist. Yeah. Because I think like if you find yourself wanting so hard to associate yourself with an idea, then that means something.
There's some radar happening.
Yeah. And if you're willing to sort of like be vulnerable to like maintain that position, like that's also very important. You know?
Okay. Cool. The other part of this is, at root, it's like I think actually this whole thing we just spent the last 5-10 minutes kind of talking about is like, is it inward looking or outward looking in a way. You have this thing about like the common advice is to do more things for yourself, not for other people. And you kind of like invert it and you say like, actually, we should point our attention out into the world.
Yes.
How like understanding what connects you to the world, your radar, what draws you in, you have to pay attention to what you're paying attention to. It almost reminded me of like, I don't know if you ever listened to or read the David Foster Wallace, This Is Water speech.
Mm-hmm.
And like, that's really his core contention is like, he's got this line about you can be trapped alone at the center of a skull-sized kingdom, worshiping some kind of thing for yourself, or you can turn your attention outwards.
Yeah.
And that was where I kind of found myself going as almost like a possible resolution for this is just like making your attention more generous. And some like generous is maybe that's a question. Like how does one cultivate that generosity of attention, that external outward facing attention?
Yeah, right. The thing that I learned from Corey, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, is one could find anything interesting if you look at it long enough or from the right direction. And I think the sort of like generosity of attention is around that, sort of like not like you have to give in completely to this idea that like I could look at this forever, you can't, like that's unproductive, but you can like open up the aperture a little bit to be able to like, I mean, what I was saying to you before we started talking, the thing that I really miss about being in New York is just like having random conversations with people on the street. And that activity sort of reminds me of this, like, anything can be interesting, because I found that you could really quickly get into that mode with someone where you both might be looking at the same thing and sort of trying to like, make a little joke or something, or like look at it from a funny angle as a way of relating to each other. And you're sort of like very quickly seeing something from someone else's perspective. So yeah, I think it's about this, like, it's about being empathetic to perspectives and like understanding that one can look at anything from a million different directions and find like a personal way in.
It's a form of kind of like looking with some amount of humility or something like that, or some amount, or even like, it's not quite like I'm searching for some kind of language, or like, it's not quite intentionless, but it's like a looking with a willingness to be surprised or something.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing that I'm talking about in this piece, or like the activity that I'm annoyed by, is like there's another way of looking, which is just like how can this thing benefit me? You know what I mean? Like,
yes.
Like I want that object. Like that will make me look good. Like that is like a really damaging mode to sort of like have as your rubric for looking at things in the world, in my opinion.
Yeah, what am I going to get from this?
What am I going to get from this?
It's almost a looking without needing anything.
Yeah.
I appreciate you indulging me on the attention thing. I interviewed you referenced in the channel for that post, Nadia Asparova's book Antimimetics, and I had a similar conversation with her, and I think the attention thing has just continued to come. There's something metaphysical about it, and it feels very sort of, it's like the one scarcity left.
Yeah. It gets so quickly metaphysical, which is why it's like, I'm like, oh, whatever, I can like be that person for a second. But like when you start talking about it, it's not like bullshit. You know what I mean? Like there is no end to the amount of attention that you can pay to something. Yeah. It's not, that's real.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about maybe a grab bag of things I would broadly describe as like design. I think like tool making, sort of maybe a form of like gardening that you do, like in shaping mainly Are.na. First, on maybe a little bit of the thread we were on, there's an interview with you in the Creative Independent back in 2017. And you say, before, when I was working on my solo show as an artist, I was thinking about what it means to be generous as an artist. At the time, I thought it was about being really personal or really open. like to the point of being diaristic or sharing images of me and my family. Towards the end of making that show, I decided, no, it's actually about tools. It's actually removing myself entirely and making things for other people to do stuff. I decided making tools is the nicest thing you can do as an artist. So Are.na still feels like a natural extension of where I was going. Are.na has changed the way I think. I continue to think about things the same way I would as if I were making art, but I just don't make art. What, maybe, I mean, that was a long time ago. Like, what is so generous about making tools? And basically, maybe more broadly, I don't want to get too in the weeds of what we were talking about just now, but like, what makes an artist generous?
Yeah.
Maybe those are two separate questions.
Yeah. I mean, that question that's super personal. I mean, I don't mean like I won't answer it. I mean like it's specific to the person and how they define that kind of thing. But for me, that's the sort of like next logical conclusion in this like conversation that I was creating with myself and like the work that I was making at the time. The thing that's generous about making tools is that like you're sort of like trying to optimize for reinterpretation, I think. At least that's how I would approach making tools. Like these things should be used in different ways. And because like I think about tools in the realm of software, I tend to like want to play with this on the spectrum of open-endedness and sort of like rigid and intentional.
Right. Well, you could argue that's generous.
Yeah. I mean, there's other parts of it too, which is that like what I would want from a tool is sort of like what I try and do with Are.na. So I'm like trying to be generous to like a person who might share my same perspective.
Is Are.na art?
No, I don't think so. No, but I do think that, everyone that we employ at Are.na has a artistic or creative background, and I think this is like, I tend to think that it's harder to learn how to make creative decisions in business than it is to sort of like learn the practical parts of running a business. So it's not art, but I like treating decision making within the context of running a business as a creative act.
And if I'm to infer correctly, your sort of baseline implication is easier to teach creative people business than teach business people to be
that's
creative.
What I think, but I'm sure a ton of people would disagree with me. Yeah.
On the note of design specifically, you reference this 37 Signals old blog post about making opinionated software, and I think it's them. They say the best software takes sides.
Yeah.
And then this is you. We tend to approach the problems we solve from a cultural perspective rather than a purely technological one. And maybe those two ideas aren't exactly related, but they felt related to me. But I'd be curious for you to actually explain that specifically the distinction of, and maybe with the lens of taking sides, like what does it mean to approach something? One very simplistic reading would be it's not mechanical. It's not the bare metal. It's actually this like much more soft, amorphous sort of human thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, like I've said a lot, like I use Are.na myself, like as a person. And so what I mean by like we try and like approach things from a cultural perspective is like an understanding of like what we would want as people who use the software, what we're seeing our community, like the other people around us who are using Are.na, what we're seeing, how they're using it, what they're coming up against, what's frustrating them. There's those things, which maybe is like a little bit more like that's table stakes, but I think there is something to be said about it actually being a sort of like rare case when one is making software that you are the, you know what I mean? Like a lot of people are making these things as like they're trying to make smart business decisions, and having like smart business decisions not be like the number one reason why we do things, and more like how is this going to add to the conversation? Like how will this change the dynamics of what people are doing on Are.na?
Yeah.
Because we're using it ourselves and we don't want the quality to dilute. So like that being the number one thing is, I think, sort of what I mean
Are you
by that.
conflating business and technology there?
I think so a little bit. I mean, yeah, like I also can't say that we like don't make strictly technical decisions, because we spend like a ton of time just trying to make things super fast.
Right. But there is a meta thing here, which is like technology wants something. Often we think of technology as being sort of value neutral. It's not.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's the other force that's pushing up against this, which is like, what is the platform?
Yeah, well, yeah, there's what does the platform want, but there's also like we have things, I mean, to what I was just saying, like the things that we're opinionated about are like, it should be super fast, like faster than is reasonable.
Yeah.
And it should be very minimal. It shouldn't have too much of a feeling. Like content should come through way more than Are.na as an interface comes through. And we think about those things just as qualities in themselves, but also like what kinds of like behavior, feelings do those qualities engender?
And so in that sense, there are cultural decisions. I was going to say they're almost like taste decisions.
Well, I mean, the weird thing
Yeah.
about like being opinionated like that is it can sound like taste,
Yeah.
and it can also sound like being principled or like having morals or something.
Sure.
But it really is just like, yeah, having an experience of using software over the lives of our entire lives, understanding the things that we think are like well done, and trying to like emulate and like push past those qualities as much as possible.
Yeah. Yep. On this note of like what the platform is going to be or wants to be, the way you talk about it often feels more like the classic kind of gardening bottom up versus top down. You say it often feels like Are.na itself has its own needs and desires, that Are.na has its own personal intuition, and that we, you and I, are figuring out what it wants to be together. We try to listen to how we all talk about Are.na, pay attention to how changes to the platform bring about new needs and ideas, and recognize the times when we, you and I, have strong urges to do something on Are.na but can't. These are the times when we know how to make Are.na more complete.
Yeah.
That goes back to so much of what you just said, the principal stuff. Like, but I'm so interested in like almost like embodying like the feeling, like what literally, maybe you could give an example, like what is happening when there's something you guys want to do and that you can't, that like crosses that thread. Because by the way, I suspect there have been times when, given that you are pretty principled, there are things you feel like you kind of want to do, maybe you, Charles, want to do that aren't right.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you like a counter example to this, which is coming up in my head as you're asking this question. The thing that people have brought up the most in terms of a feature request over the lifespan of Are.na is like, I want to be able to see my channels and other people's channels in graph view. Like I want to see this thing like a nodal map. And like we've definitely, I mean, people have explored it with our API. We've explored it. We keep coming back to this like conclusion that it's just a novelty and it doesn't actually provide anything like useful
for every product.
Yeah. And it's like, and it's a thing that feels like it would be valuable in some way, but actually like doesn't deliver in the way that, at least from the way that we're using Are.na, it doesn't deliver in the way that you think it's going to deliver.
Almost like the Are.na doesn't want that.
I mean, yeah. And like, unfortunately or unfortunately, like that's our particular take. But it's also one of the reasons why we're like, we're opinionated that like Are.na should always have an API. And that is like, it's feeling more and more like a radical position because like the things that live on Are.na, there's no algorithm. It's people doing this, and that's super rare, you know? Like people are categorizing information, you know, and like they're doing it because
What
it's
a
like,
waste of time.
well, I mean, yeah. No, it's just yeah, it's a wild thing to think about. And I think that it is just inherently valuable, but at the same time, we do believe that like there are interpretations of like what Are.na can and should do that someone should have the ability to enact if they want.
It's almost two spiritual aspects of the platform that are kind of at odds, but you're allowing them to exist in slight tension.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I know Ted Nelson has been very influential. Two ideas from him. One, mediums are infinitely harder to create than media.
Yeah.
And two, recognizing parallelism as an essential part of thought, which I think is obviously very, very central for his work, but I think is at the very least influential to you.
Mm-hmm.
Also, one other line from you. The key is that Are.na isn't doing the work for me at all. It's just an environment that is oriented to this type of activity. Yeah. Which is almost getting at the medium idea a little bit. Yeah. Like, I'm curious what's been most important in creating that environment you talk about. Quite literally, I would call Are.na a medium. Yeah. And why is, whether it's literally parallelism as Ted describes it, or just bidirectional linking, like why that's been so important to create this type of environment that produces what you want.
I mean, to like put it in way dumber terms, yeah, like I think I think like what we're trying to get at is like what are the optimal conditions to get at the kind of content that we want. In order for that content to come in, one has to have the quality of being fascinated with something, you know? Yeah. So the parallelism or the structures of Are.na, like even the positions that we take as a business, like saying like no algorithms ever, like one way to think about it, one very real way to think about it is like these are the conditions that have to exist in order for like the good content to come through. It's
a very strict constraint in some sense. Yeah. Or prompt.
Yeah. But like because it has this sort of like a little bit of a learning curve, like it has an open-endedness that feels ungenerous at first. It's a threshold. It's a threshold. Yeah.
One idea that comes up a lot is, and maybe you're pointing at different things. I even have a few interpretations, but is this idea of space. One place you say, I don't always want to be augmented. I want space in my software, which is maybe capturing the real kind of essence of it. And then you go on, it's just a bunch of people recognizing that it's really hard to think when you're attached to the internet all the time, which is really poignant. And then finally, in this piece you have on Bohm dialogue, the longer one, you say, it's so easy to treat technology as though it can prescribe a solution to a particular problem. Software developers build complex workflows, create new methods for faster communication, and tune information delivery to an individual level. But what humans really need is much more simple: time and space to think and process. There are, I think, actually like two kind of core articulations of space that fit Are.na. One is the one I was just describing with all those quotes, which is like almost like negative space or something, a gap. The other is actually like spatial interfaces. Yeah. Both are clearly very deeply seated in how you design this product. I'm curious why, one, to the extent they ever interact, and two, like why you, particularly on the negative space one, like why you kind of keep seemingly coming back to that. Maybe it's just a personal thing. Maybe it's about that threshold.
Yeah. I mean, like also part of what I'm trying to point out with that is like it's about what we do, but it's also like what we don't do. So like not like deciding not to do these like graph things or like be too heavy on animation or like design an interface that like looks too slick in one particular direction is like another form
Space.
of space. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like letting the person's content intention or whatever, all that stuff come through more than what we're doing. It's a really fine line to us, I think, that like it should look good, but also not really like too much of anything.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
it's like a really hard thing to pull off, but I like that's what we aspire to.
It's a good transition. One of my favorite things I read of yours is actually this blog post on Arial, your new typeface, which is Areal, misspelling of the proper Arial. A few ideas that I actually think play so well into what you just said about space. First is Johannes Breyer at Dynamo, who designed the font, or he and his team. He says, he's talking about Arial, it's a system font. So at another stage, it also became a kind of non-choice for a certain type of graphic designer who didn't want to make a point of choosing a cool or new font. But of course, choosing to go with the default is also a choice.
Yes.
Part of what you were just saying.
Yeah.
The question became, if we want to make a font for Are.na, but they already have the perfect font, how can we update Are.na's identity with a meaningful gesture? And finally, the hope is that you can't really spot a difference. Looking at Arial and Arial should feel like refreshing a browser page. It's the same, but it isn't.
Yeah.
Even references this woman, Kristen Sue Lucas,
Yes.
who refreshed by changing her legal name from Kristen Sue Lucas to Kristen Sue Lucas.
Yes.
Kind of insane.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just read one last quote from you. This was in that interview. When we made this interface change, our desire was to be as default as we could so that Are.na wouldn't get in the way of the content. In other words, we wanted Are.na to look good, but to fade into the background as much as possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great design fading into the background is a little oxymoronic, right? Like, or it's a little paradoxical. Like, in theory, all design should sort of it's such a delicate thing to have design not show up.
Yeah.
It's hard for me even reading this, like the Arial thing. Like, I both know that it actually was functionally better for you guys, but it almost reads as performance art or something.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like it is, but it's not. Like
Right.
the new Arial, by the way, like I did a presentation a couple of days ago in like a class, and I realized that the computer that I was showing it on did not have Arial, and I could tell the difference immediately.
Wow.
Because the kerning on Arial is like so fucked up. So when you look at new Arial versus old Arial, like it's minor, but there is like a real.
So
like,
it's maybe the essence of that great design fading in the background is not that it's unnoticeable, but it might have to be pointed out for you to notice. Like, you should feel the benefits without noticing them.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, yeah. You should feel the benefits without noticing them. Yeah.
Only in actually looking at the old version would you notice.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And now there's no way to look at. I mean, I guess you could just modify the CSS on new Are.na and see the difference. Yeah, it wasn't purely gestural. Like, yeah, it has like a real utility, but it's at this sort of like Arial, the font to us, the original Arial, the Microsoft Arial, was nearly perfect, and Johannes and Fabiola, who worked on Arial, made it like 100% complete. So to us, that's so satisfying, and I think like it's just part of this contextual whole that makes it very special and beautiful without it looking like too much of anything.
How do you conceivably justify something like that, given that you have very constrained resources?
I mean, honestly, it was a partnership between both of us, so it was just like a fun thing that we both got to work on together. We don't have the same kind of relationship with Dynamo that like a huge startup might have, you know. It's like
Cool.
like Johannes and I are friends.
Yeah, and by the way, it's
yeah,
also time, but like The answer, I think, also can be that you wanted to, and that you wanted to do something for the community.
Yeah. I think Johannes is approaches Dynamo in the same way that we approach Are.na, which is that like we love working on it and we find it endlessly interesting. And he loves like the collaborations that we try and do now are just like people that we want to work on things with because it's fun. You know what I mean? And because we share a similar way of looking at the world.
My last two kind of sections go together, which are about effectively building businesses, but specifically building independent businesses and software businesses. I think you alluded to this briefly earlier, but you are clearly an advocate for creative people starting businesses. A few lines from you, and particularly with the notion that maybe they're unlikely to do so. We have a very limited conception of the type of person who starts a business, especially tech businesses. When I talk to artists, young creative people, I always recommend starting a business. And then finally, Are.na itself is what drives me to be entrepreneurial in order to make it more resilient. You wrote somewhere that you felt complicated about your first commercial art show. And yet you have a seemingly very healthy commercial relationship with this project. Maybe it's, as you said earlier, maybe it's because it's not art, but there's some other part too where you were talking about like businesses are great, like people like patronage, but like patronage, you have to answer to a very specific person. Like you're almost talking about like the commercial part of it being this like freeing container. And so I'm curious about like in this spectrum between, you could make a case that Are.na itself has patronage, actually. Its business model of patronage. But in the spectrum between patronage and business, in terms of like a fuel to do something creative or do something important, how you think about what a business is and what it allows for, and like why it's so like what is driving you to want to persuade more and more creative people to adopt this kind of fuel or shape?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of reasons. For software in particular, I just think the internet, the web would be infinitely more interesting and healthy if there were just different takes towards what making a business online is. And especially businesses like ours that have this sort of like cultural or social component. Like, I don't think that the ways in which we think of being social online represent all the ways that one could be social online. And I don't think it's like this particular type of way of funding software businesses that is going to find all of those ways of
meaning like the venture capital industrial complex.
Yeah. Sure.
But so my and maybe I should let you finish, but the obvious critique here would be that like the reason we don't have more of these is we don't have the business models for them.
Yeah. And that's what I mean about like creative decision making. And I don't think that like Are.na's business model is by any means creative. But I do think like subscriptions in our case is a business model that is it's really symbiotic with how we want to work on Are.na, because we're providing an environment, and the question is just like, do you find this environment valuable enough to like help us continue maintain and build it?
Yes.
And so the relationship is like so simple that it is almost radical at this point.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, you said somewhere you're the only social media or social network that its users pay it.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe that's not like entirely true, but it's definitely the only social network where the like relationship between the people who make it and the people who use it is like really understandable.
Yes.
You know, it's very straightforward. It's like almost dumb. But I think that there are much more interesting ways of figuring out like different setups for that, and ways that people who are using software and people who are making software can be more aligned.
Yeah, to borrow a frame from my friend Chris, it's like business model product fit in this context is actually quite rare.
Yeah.
I think another piece of this, to be honest, is your business model isn't that creative, but you have something else that's rare, which is a whole lot of patience.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, part of the other thing that is radical about Are.na is just that we keep continuing to do it, that there's a commitment to it. And it's also why I try and sort of like illustrate this relationship that we have as like people who are using the product.
Yeah.
Like we're like in the same place as people who don't work on Are.na.
Yes.
Like we're right there. And if
Yeah.
something frustrates a person who's using it, it probably frustrates us too.
I thought it was cool to look over on the note of patience. There's one line where you're like, success as a business relies on people who love Are.na enough to pay for it. So getting to 400 paying customers was a big deal for us.
Yeah.
And then you're like, now that we're about $70,000 in revenue and you're now at 18,000 paying users. Something like that.
It's going to be 20,000 pretty soon.
20,000, over $100,000 in revenue. Has it gotten easier or harder to be patient?
Much easier. Yeah. I mean, I think for the longest time when we had to do other things to just like functionally exist, like do freelance projects or work other jobs or that kind of thing. It's just exhausting. Now I feel like we've reached like this is the ultimate goal. To be able to work on Are.na all the time is like that's like the bag, and so like continuing that is like or making that like stronger is like we're motivated to do that.
You're coming up on your 15-year anniversary this year.
Yeah.
A quote I really loved. One question that is still hard to answer after 10 years of working on Are.na is, what's the long-term vision? This is difficult for a few reasons. One reason is that we have to calibrate our definition of long-term with the person who is asking the question. Are.na is a lifelong project. Our ideal outcome as a company is not becoming the next Facebook, God forbid. It's becoming the next Nishiyama Onsen, pronunciation here, Kyokan, a hot spring hotel in Japan and one of the world's oldest businesses, around 705 AD. You go on to say the slow blade, quoting Dune, the slow blade penetrates the shield. I do think it's worth considering slowness as a strength. What an amazing to imagine a business that old, but especially amazing to think about a software thing in that way. I guess my question is like, beyond just being patient and being intentional, what has or what will make Are.na more anti-fragile for the chance of lasting another 15 years or beyond?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Lasting another 15 years is one thing. I think lasting past us retiring is like a different thing. And I think a thing that Are.na has going for it in that regard is it's like almost nothing, like as a piece of software, it's like extremely I mean, it's complex, but it's like compared to other things, it's like not that complicated. And I think it has a sort of structure that could be remade in different forms very easily. So it's like, I don't know. I sort of go back and forth about this, but I think that one part of its strength is that like it's a software, but it's also an orientation. And the orientation is like something that can manifest in different ways.
It's funny you say that. One of the thoughts, I didn't do the research, but my expectation is that onsen, like, it probably hasn't been the building. It probably hasn't. I don't even know if it's in the land.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
But there's some threat. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think when you think about that durable of a time frame, you're probably there's some asterisks, but there's some threat.
Yeah. And I think that the orientation of like something as simple as just like, this is a piece of software that the people who are making it like are deeply committed to and use as individuals and feel like they need as like a as like a part of them, the other businesses that I sort of like look to in part for inspiration have this sort of same quality and feel to me like they could also have this kind of like they gesture towards longevity, you know.
Can you give a couple examples?
Well, like I'm not like the hugest Obsidian user, or like I'm not like a complex Obsidian user, but I like appreciate like that as like another manifestation of an orientation that is sort of manifest in a piece of software, and how those two things play back and forth, you know.
My last kind of primary section that obviously relates is about a awesome piece you wrote recently about personal business, and a natural kind of thread of building independent businesses. A slug of quotes from you that I think maybe set the tone. When I started running Are.na with friends 14 years ago, it often felt like having such a personal stake in what we were doing would be a liability. Today, it's often perceived as an asset. I'm not especially pro-capitalism, but I am pro doing something really hard that you care about desperately and unabashedly. You alluded to this earlier, but I wouldn't be running a business if it weren't for Are.na. It's a very personal business, meaning that it is something I want to see in the world. It is a tool that I would personally be devastated if it were to not exist. And finally, I've never wanted to walk away, even when we ran out of money. I think it's the coolest thing on the internet. I don't know what else I would do. Maybe you got at this slightly, but like, can you make your case for more people starting these types of personal businesses?
Oh man.
Maybe especially digital or software ones?
Yeah. I think that if you're the type of person that feels critical of the way that social interaction happens online, or your relationship to information is compromised,
Okay,
of
so
which
all of
there
us.
are probably like a billion people who fit this qualification. I mean, it's easier than ever to create software. It's like cheaper than ever, you know? Like people can figure out ways of like playing around with this stuff and feeling the sort of like right shapes and orientations of things. And I think it's a very important place to experiment in, because it's ridiculous that there's just like a single type of person making this type of software.
What I was going to say is like, I actually think there's a huge, especially in the last 6 months, cloud code, whatever. Like
Sure.
the way what's happening in the LLMs is the disposition towards making software is like, oh my gosh, you can just do things.
Yes.
Perhaps the implication there is that you're saying that's generally one type of person. Because what I was going to say is that it sort of feels like, if anything, the disposition has been like, maybe the good aspect of it is there's a lightness. The negative aspect, it definitely doesn't feel like the way you talk about a personal business. It's not heavy and meaningful and caring.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
just throw stuff out.
No. I mean to say that like the resources are available if you feel like you can be opinionated about these types of things, and you can sort of start to shape your opinionatedness easier than you might have done so earlier. Like learning HTML, learning PHP, like my process for like learning how to write software took a really, really long time. And that time, like one doesn't have to spend that amount of time now in the sort of same way. I mean, like there's a limit to what I'm saying, I think, because I don't totally believe that you could do these things at a scale that would be meaningful just yet.
Give it 4 more months of Claude.
Who knows? Yeah. But I mean, but I do think that like, yeah, I think there are a lot of like young people, a lot of people with like weird and opinionated ways of how they want to interact with the world and with each other, and figuring out like more interesting ways of manifesting those behaviors online. Yeah, it feels important. I like, that's a long way of saying like, I think the drive and motivation has to come first. The feeling like that something should exist that doesn't already exist, and that you can maybe, there's a way for you to try and articulate that.
Perhaps there's a group of people who have that. The thing they don't have that in short supply. They have the technical ability in short supply, or whatever. It goes back to your earlier point around that maybe more creative people should start, but they're unlikely to. But that is the thing that perhaps the software world has been slightly lacking, is people who have that kind of set of perspective to approach it from a new. We've had a lot of people approach it from a specific kind of way.
Yes. Yes. A lot of people approaching it from a specific kind of way, but also like the expectation that making a software business will follow, like in the best case, a particular time scale
Yeah.
and trajectory,
Yeah.
and that these things will ultimately cease to exist. Like making something with the idea that like the point is to cash out at some point,
Or even like, I don't know, your history of the Are.na. I don't know if I have all the details, but it wasn't, you were kind of eating glass for a little while. You definitely weren't working on it full time.
Yeah.
You could hardly like, and so, but I think that goes back to being personal, which is like, I need this.
Yeah. 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 And I mean, I can think of people who are like doing this kind of thing and, like also in this phase of figuring out how to make it their like full-time thing or their life's work, and it feels super positive. Yeah, I don't know how to like it's an interesting thing to try and pitch because well, okay, I'll say the other thing, consider the possibility that working with your friends on something that you think is cool is like the most luxurious possible thing that you can do,
Independent of the reward.
yeah. No, the reward is the work. The like that you get to hang out with your friends and make something cool. Like that's the reward. And figuring out a way to keep doing that is like it's
That's the
easy
challenge, but
yeah, that's a challenge, but it's easy to do once you like start experiencing it.
I like that.
Yeah.
Maybe as just to wade a little further in the waters of a template for this, you were talking about kind of the approach. You say offer products, services, and or experiences that are both high quality and idiosyncratic, the type of business that both sustains and is sustained by a community. Again, getting at that business model product fit thing a little bit, but like I'm curious what you think, like what you think about the shape of businesses or products or customers that do tend to like, what is it about that relationship that is productive for these types of businesses, whether it be something like Are.na or the local, whatever, grocery store, bookstore, or whatever? Is it intimacy?
Well, I think it's that, yeah, it's something about intimacy, but it's also about infrastructure, it's like providing a thing, a place, a armature for like other activity to happen within, and that someone can rely on that.
It can become theirs.
Yeah. It can become theirs, but there's a dependability that comes over like a long period of time.
I was texting you about this yesterday. One of the, in this, this time it's personal Are.na channel, you have this just incredible SoftBank deck from 2010 where Masa's like hardcore brain blasting, vision questing. He has a slide about happiness, and happiness is about being touched by seeing, touched by interactions, love, learning, playing. He has this thing where he's talking about when you get lost, look into the far distance whenever you get lost. And this is how SoftBank's going to go from its 30-year vision to its 300-year vision. And one of the things you texted me is we need that Masa back. And so what this prompted for me is like, maybe all founder-led businesses are personal.
Mm-hmm.
And if so, like, do people just sort of forget why they're here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, part of it I think has to do with like the sort of like typical way that most large software businesses are funded and the expectations of growth.
Yeah.
I think it's hard to maintain. I mean, the way that they're funded, the expectation is an exit, like in some form. It's not really typical that like a company might get investment and pay dividends or something over time. I think that for me, this is related to sort of like another question that sometimes comes up when someone on Are.na is sort of like feeling that it's like getting a little bit bigger. And the question is like, do you think Are.na can get too big, or do you think its like quality will diminish as it grows? And my answer for that is usually that like it can grow really big. It just has to do it slowly enough. And like the issue is mostly the sort of like time scale expectations of a business more so than it is like that it's
Right.
getting super
Right.
big.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Maybe that applies especially to a community or social
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
But it probably, I mean, there's probably some like broad analogy around all growing living things. Like things, it's not good to grow too fast.
Yeah.
It's funny. It makes me think of I once met with somebody at LVMH, and they were talking about how like it's actually bad if any of their brands grow. It's like more than 15% year over year or something, or 25%.
Wow.
Because it's sort of like when you're in the business of 100-year brands,
Yeah.
you don't want a 200% year.
No.
Like that's actually showing that something's
Scary.
wrong. Or you've totally mismanaged supply and demand.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's inspiring.
yeah, it was cool. It was cool. I have just a few more kind of miscellaneous things. I thought I would ask this before we got here, but what do you think of the word authenticity?
Oh yeah. Yeah, this was coming up during that like here for the wrong reasons essay.
Yeah.
I think I'm a bit of, in the same way that I'm like a poser apologist, I'm like a bit of a authenticity apologist, just in that I sort of believe that like one could fully understand themselves, like I was saying before, and like that to me is synonymous with authenticity. You know what I mean?
The
I
fact
don't,
that you believe it is possible, or at the very least, it's worth approaching.
well, the authenticity is possible because it's possible to understand, to get better at understanding oneself.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, it's like, I must be an optimist. Like,
Yeah.
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 I can't remember where I found this. It's generally a good idea to try to apply metaphors to places where they don't quite fit. I think that's from you.
I said that?
I think so. It's possible I got it from some other channel, but it felt representative of something that is happening inside of Are.na.
Yeah.
And the patterns.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's the thing that I was talking about earlier, which is like it's just useful to try and look at something with the frame of mind that it could be interesting. So it's like applying a gaze to something that might not be there implicitly.
Right.
Ready
to see.
Ready to see
what might be there.
Yeah.
You have a piece about it, and I didn't get to like fully deep dive the David Bohm and Bohm dialogue stuff, but I'm curious what you think we can all learn from what either stood out to you in that or the research you've done, or what you think he was getting at in dialogue that was really unique.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, super long, super big topic, but he was a very classically trained quantum physicist who sort of had this long trajectory towards simplifying what his overarching interest or message was, where it went from hard physics to like thinking and thought and what that meant. And so he wrote this book called On Dialogue, which is all about this like sort of like a proposal for a practice, which is like a bunch of people sit in a circle. You try and have you essentially try and have a generative conversation, and the point is that everyone is supposed to add on to what another person is saying. And then the place that you sort of get to ideally is that everyone is sharing a thought, and you're sort of like looking at it, you're all looking at it, and it's like out there, and you can sort of start to view it from different angles. And I have to say, like, Laurel Schwolst and I did organize one Bohm dialogue once, and it was like it was really incredible.
How is it different from hanging out with 10 people?
There's like an intentionality and settingness to it that changes things.
Yeah.
And like what you're supposed to do is sort of like lay out these like very simple rules, which I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's essentially like you can't change topics, you have to add on to things, and you end up talking and you talk about thinking, and it gets,
but it's structured and generative.
It's not so structured. It's very open-ended. It's structured only in that like
Maybe focused?
focused. Yeah, focused. But like one comment that I have that I really remember is someone describing it as like the cartoon where uh it's like a train and it's putting the track ahead of
Cool.
itself while it's going.
Felt that way.
And
Felt that
yeah,
way a lot.
yeah. And you know, when you have like a good conversation, that's
Yeah.
how it feels. But when you have that good conversation stretched out to like 10 people, it's super interesting.
So
Yeah.
the number, it's critically,
I think it's part of it that there's like a number of people that do it. That's the thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm excited to learn more.
Yeah.
You said you could talk for 2.5 hours about it earlier. What else have you learned from skateboarding?
Well, I think like skateboarding, like art, has a snobbiness to it that can feel like being principled, that is actually something that's slightly different. I'm trying to think of like which one of these like stupid rules that skateboarding has. Like there's a person who describes the middle of the board as the forbidden 14, as it's like the 14 inches that one should not slide.
Stand on? Okay.
Like you can't do a board slide, but you can do nose and tail slides.
Oh.
Like one should not do any slides that involve the middle of the board. That's the forbidden 14. So there's like all these sort of like random made up rules that are like principles for like what is like correct or right. You know, and they are all arbitrary, you know, like they're all just made up by people, but it's like, but it comes across as some kind of like.
It's also funny in a sport or an activity that is so like punk in so many ways and so not about the rules.
Yeah.
It's got its own.
Yeah, when systems like that are entirely open-ended, that's the sort of like rules that people make up. And it's the same sort of like framing that happens on Are.na, where someone's just like this is now a guest book. This is an open channel that is a guest book. Like I'm calling it a guest book, and this is how you interact with it. And so there's these behaviors that emerge when like a system is open-ended like that.
Yeah, we didn't talk about it, but I was enjoying, you have a rules are rules channel that I was enjoying perusing across. It's fun. The freedom that comes from certain types of arbitrary constraints.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas you listed him as it was one of those kind of like key kind of early, some like ex-girlfriend's friend introduced you. I'm just curious if there was anything that really stood out.
Yeah, Library of Babel is just like a short story that's just has obvious connections to not just Are.na, but like people thinking about hypertext and all that. Do you know this one?
I haven't read it.
Oh, wow. Yeah, super short. You can read it tonight. It's basically about a library that is infinite in all directions, and there's a certain every book has a certain number of characters, and there are librarians who wander this library looking for a book that has like a phrase that any kind of phrase at all, because it's every permutation of like all these. So most of the time you're going into a room and you're opening a book and it's just nonsense.
Yeah. But it's kind of like the monkeys.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly like that. So sometimes you'll go into a room and find like a single phrase that is like, you know, the right phrase at the right time kind of thing.
We have any chance of bringing back directions to lastvisitor.com?
Yeah, I should do that, but I don't know if it's possible anymore. So directions. Directions to Last Visitor was it was a website that you would go to, and it would geolocate you and give you Google Maps directions to the person who visited the website before you.
Automatically pulling their like latitude data.
Yeah. And right. That is also kind of like the reaction that most people had of it, like that it was some sort of like privacy violation. But the point that I was sort of coming to it from was like removing myself outside of the equation and letting two people make this connection without me. You know what I mean?
Medium.
Yeah.
You have, I believe, the Delaware C Corp name for Are.na is When It Changed.
Yeah.
Why was that moment so meaningful?
We that comes from a William Gibson. So in he has a trilogy of books called the Bridge Trilogy, and it's sort of like this post-apocalyptic situation that the apocalypse moment is never really fully described, but it's called When It Changed.
Huh.
And in the early days of Are.na, there were sort of like multiple eras where we were forming and reforming this corporation. And when we finally like got control of it ourselves, we called it When It Changed, just as like any like association that we can make. Like, yeah, we've had like a million William Gibson. Our first mobile app was called Case. Like we always try. Yeah. If there's any consistent naming scheme, it comes from Gibson stuff.
Uh, on the Are.na Influences channel, there is a tree that owns itself. Do you know what this is?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why is that meaningful to you?
I didn't
I believe now it's the son of the tree that owns itself.
Yeah, I didn't put that in there, but now that I'm thinking about it, yeah, John Michael Bowling put that in there, and that's like I don't even know if that's an artwork. It's just like a situation that exists, that he has always like referenced as like a major thing. And I think he's pointing to something. He was actually pointing to something really early that I think we're pointing to now, which is just that like somehow this thing should like have a life of its own that should exist outside of like the people who made it, you know? Yeah.
For people who don't know, this is a tree that apparently somehow legally owns the small area around it that it is on.
Yeah.
Also, apparently called a Jackson Oak, so I will take the
namesake.
Nice. Just a few more things. There's an interview with Kel. I'm forgetting her last name. You were asked, what are the things you'd like to do in your life that are doable? I'm going to read the list. Number 1, switchback tail shove, which I Googled, is sick. So sick. Number 2, nollie crooked grind. Number 3, pivot fakie. Number 4, read in search of lost time. The top 4 alone was already really great. Number 5, kiretsu, which I think I looked up, but I don't know what it is. 6, pass on Are.na to future employees. And 7, run a small used bookstore. Any reflections, any additions, any updates on this list?
Yeah, no, that was a very recent list. And yeah, I was trying to think of things that are like infinitely doable. And I think in my there's like a limit to how long one can skateboard for. I'm like essentially past that limit, but like,
hey, Brian Johnson's gonna figure it out for you.
Thank you, Brian Johnson.
You get metallic limbs or whatever.
Yeah, those are like doable tricks that are also like within this weird sort of like rubric for what I consider to be tasteful skateboarding. Yeah, the kiretsu is a thing that Japanese businesses did at one point, where they like two sort of like complementary businesses would buy shares of each other or exchange shares to sort of like solidify a harmonious relationship. And we also sort of like imagine a future world where Are.na sort of like has this relationship to other people's businesses that we sort of like take inspiration from.
Yeah, almost marrying them together or something.
Yeah.
I brought it up before we started recording, but one of your longtime channels is The Secret Agent. It remains quite secret and mysterious, but I'm curious if you can impart any insight for the rest of us on what's going on then in there, that pattern.
Yeah, that's like I know exactly what seeded that, which is there was a toy when I was a kid called Spy Tools, and it was just like a black light and like a little alarm system and like a fingerprinting kit and all of this stuff. And I like loved the look of it. I can like still imagine the logo. But I think the thing that is interesting about that to me now, apart from these sort of like literal secret agents, is what part mystery plays in making like a concept or an idea attractive, and like what the sort of like level of mystery that something has to have that makes it sort of like compelling.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I was thinking of I had a walkie-talkie watches at one point.
Yeah. Yeah.
You said, I like every age more than the last. Any advice on making that more likely?
That's a little bit of a manifest. Like I'm trying to manifest that idea, that sentiment in myself. Like I do like every age more than the last. But sometimes it's like hard to like every age more than the last. But I don't know. When I think about like the sort of, I like having had a really long relationship. I mean, in the context of this conversation, to like something like Are.na, to have like a project that I feel like I can work on for the rest of my life. Having that like time span to me is like super special. And I realize how lucky I am and we are to be able to have that. So like, yeah, the benefit of experience, like I do see a lot of value in that.
You're deep into the compounding.
Yeah.
This is a quote from the Are.na Influences channel. What strikes me is the fact that in our society, art has become something which is related only to objects and not to individuals or to life. That art is something which is specialized or which is done by experts who are artists. But couldn't everyone's life become a work of art? Why should the lamp or the house be an art object, but not our life? That's Foucault.
Yeah.
How do you make sense of what art is?
Yeah, I think it's funny to be like, this is what we talked about before. But I do think it is about this sort of like being able to make decisions that are creative, and what is creative is like, from my perspective, most personal. So any kind of decision making could be creative if it's like coming from this particularly personal place. Yeah.
One more thing should probably come as no surprise. In the film You've Got Mail, Joe, Tom Hanks's character, is telling Meg Ryan's character, what's her name?
Kathleen Kelly.
Kathleen, that it isn't personal.
Yeah.
To which she replies, I'm so sick of everyone saying that. That just means it wasn't personal to you, but it was personal to me. It was personal to a lot of people. What's so wrong with being personal anyway? Whatever else anything is, it ought to begin by being personal. How do you try to remember to keep things personal?
Well, for Are.na at this point, it's like, I don't have to try.
It's automatic.
I have to try not to make everything personal, basically. Yeah. If I try and imagine a world where Are.na didn't exist and I would be compelled to make another business, like how I would tune that relationship. And yeah, I think setting up a scenario where you are the person who's using the thing is the only way to do that. And it has to be something that you're sufficiently opinionated about.
And probably invested in,
opinionated about, all of those things. Yeah, for sure.
That's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again for listening or watching. And I'd like to thank Notion, Dialectic's presenting partner, one more time. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, Notion is a tool that allows you to have leverage across the work, the ideas, the writing, whatever it might be that is most important to doing what you do. And the way they think about AI and agents is all about giving you more leverage to focus on the things that really matter, to allow you to have deeper attention on the real work. Meanwhile, you can delegate to Notion's AI and agents for all of the incremental work, the busy work, the synthesis, whatever it might be. I found it's even helpful to have Notion AI just give me a second set of eyes as I'm trying to parse through all of the most important ideas in my research or after the fact as I review my conversations. You can check out Notion at notion.com/dialectic. And you can learn all about all of the ways Notion has evolved in recent years in terms of giving you more leverage, particularly with AI and agents. You can find all the links and full transcript for this episode at dialectic.fm/cab or CAB. That's dialectic.fm/cab. Or I'll have a transcript, all the links, all of the platforms the episode's available on, and more. And once again, thank you so much to Notion for presenting Dialectic, and thank you to you for listening and making it all possible. I hope you're inspired, and I hope you give your attention more deeply and more generously. I'll see you next time.